All right, I'm going to jump right in and start building something inside of Illustrator so that you can get a feel for the tools that you'll be able to use, and you'll kind of see my workflow for making and building things within Illustrator. And I want you to follow along with me so that you can really start to get your hands dirty and see how Illustrator works. So, to open it up, I'm going to click on the Adobe Creative Cloud helper up here. Find Illustrator and click on Open. This is where you can find all of your Adobe applications anytime that you want to open one. Now this might take a little bit to open up, but here we go. I've got Illustrator. All right, so I want to make a new document. To do that, I'm just going to click on this Create New button. And this gives us a whole lot of different buttons, a lot of things to look at, but don't get overwhelmed. It's good that we have lots of options because that way we can completely customize exactly the type of document that we want to be working in. Now, without getting into too much detail right now, I'm just going to come over to the Web tab up here at the top, and this gives us some presets that fit under the Web category, graphics that are going to exist online. So I'm going to open up all of my presets right here by clicking on View All Presets. There's one down here that says 800 by 600, and this is the width and height of the document. It's a decently small size document, but that's okay. I'm going to click on that one, and before I actually make my document, I'm going to come over to my preset details on the side, and instead of having it 800 wide by 600 tall, I want to swap those two. So we have this little orientation section right here. You can see that we've got a little picture of a person and then a rectangle that's wider than it is tall. That's referred to as landscape when the dimensions are wider than they are tall. But we have another one right here where the person is oriented more in a portrait mode. That's what that is called when the height is taller than the width or larger than the width. So portrait is what we want. As I click that, you see that my width and height swapped. So now we're 600 wide by 800 tall. That's all we have to do here to make a document the size that I want it. So ignore everything else for now and click Create. This is going to give us a blank white canvas to start building artwork on. And before I go any further, I'm going to just change the way that Illustrator looks, because right now you're probably overwhelmed looking at all these different panels and thinking, what in the world are all these sliders and colors and buttons, and it might be a little bit overwhelming. Fortunately, we can customize this so that we're not distracted by controls that we don't need, and it'll be much easier to look at. So I'm going to come up to this little drop down right here. It says Jake's right now. This is my workspace drop-down menu. If I click on it, you can see that the one that's selected is called Jake's. This is my customized Illustrator preferred layout that I typically work in, but there's some other presets that Adobe gives us, and the one that I want to be using is called Essentials. So I'm going to click on that, which you'll notice has much less stuff going on, and it's just a lot cleaner. I'm not so distracted by other things. Great, so that's going to work out fine. I'm just going to click on this little double arrow right here so that I have a little bit more room so you can see my face a little bit easier. But you can keep that collapsed or expanded, whatever you'd like. It just swaps the tools that we have available from being in a single row to two different columns. Okay, so Illustrator's all set up. What are we looking at? Well, this white rectangle right here in the middle of my document with this little tiny black outline is called the artboard. The artboard is kind of like a canvas. You can think of that like a painter has a canvas to paint on. The artboard is the workspace of my document that I can build things on, and it's what is going to be visible when I save this or export this for sharing with other people. Now, I can actually have things existing outside of this art box. They just won't show up as I export them, but that's kind of a way to think of it. This entire gray area in the background is kind of like your desktop or something that you have a piece of paper on. You have all this extra room around it, maybe a table. So you can set your tools down, you can sketch some stuff and set it off to the side, but this canvas, your artboard right in the middle, is what is ultimately going to be your artwork. Okay, so you saw me navigating around a little bit right there, but I didn't really explain what I was doing. To be able to zoom in and out and move your document around, pan around it, I'm using keyboard shortcuts. But before we get to those, I'm just going to point out how to do it using tools, because as a first-time Illustrator user, if you've never done this before, it's important to know where these tools are within the program so you can get to them. But then after you've understood where they are and how they work, it's really, really important to start using hotkeys or keyboard shortcuts to navigate the software more efficiently. And this is across the board for all Adobe applications, because it will really increase your efficiency. So first of all, how did I zoom in and out? Well, this button right here is my zoom tool. It looks like a little magnifying glass. If I click on it, then I have this magnifying glass with a plus icon instead of a normal mouse pointer. So in Illustrator, all I have to do to zoom in and out is click and hold, and then drag in one direction or the other. If I go to the left, it zooms out. If I go to the right, it zooms in. So it's kind of like a little scrubby zoom, and that's really, really handy. If your zoom tool isn't behaving like that, it's probably because your graphics card isn't optimized for Illustrator. So if I come up to View and say Preview on CPU, this is going to disable my ability to zoom in and out by clicking and scrubbing. Instead, I can click once to zoom in, and then if I hold down Option or Alt on a PC, you see that my plus sign is now a minus sign. And if I click once and click again a bunch of times, there we go, I'm zooming out every time, and it zooms from where I clicked. So if I want to go to the top left corner, I can do it like that. If I want to zoom out from the right edge, I can do it like that. Great. Now, I prefer to use the little scrubby zoom feature, so I usually preview on the GPU. But again, just to show you some more options, if you don't have that GPU preview, with the zoom tool selected, you can also click and drag a box. You see that's kind of like a selection, this dashed line. And when I let go, it's going to zoom to that selection. So that's a handy way to be able to zoom into a very specific portion without having to click in and out a whole bunch. Okay, so that's how you zoom. Now, how do I reposition this canvas so that I can go to very specific points? Well, the tool right next to the zoom tool is called the hand tool. This is how you can kind of grab your canvas and move it around. So I'm going to click on that, and then you see now I have my hand tool instead of that zoom icon, the magnifying glass icon, and I can click and drag this around freely. I can move it however I want. Simple as that. Now, a very handy keyboard shortcut, because it is very, very important to learn these keyboard shortcuts early on. There's no reason not to start using them right away. But if I was on the zoom tool and I wanted to zoom in a little bit here and maybe the canvas moved far off to the right and I didn't want it quite that far, I like the zoom level, I just don't like the position. All I have to do, instead of coming over to the hand tool and clicking on it, is hold down the space bar. You see that my hand tool is now active. I'm holding down space bar this whole time, and that's temporarily switching to the hand tool. Then I can click and drag, reposition. Great, and now let's say I'm too close. I'll just hold down Option or Alt and click space bar to reposition, and there we go. We're nice and centered up, and I can see my whole artboard. And the keyboard shortcut, by the way, for the zoom tool is really easy to remember because it's just Z. Z for zoom, super easy to remember. So if I was on any other tool and I just press Z on the keyboard, I'm on my zoom tool. So when I navigate my document, if you're seeing me move around, reposition, zoom in and out really fast, it's usually because I have my hand on the keyboard and I'm just used to pressing the space bar with my thumb, tapping the Z key to switch to the zoom tool, and then I typically, like I said, use the GPU preview, which allows me to do this scrubby zoom. So I'm going to just very quickly reposition, zoom in and out, and that is how I'm navigating around my document. Now that we know how to navigate around our document very easily, let's start making something. So I'm going to jump in to building some very simple shapes. So I'm going to come over to my Tools panel over here on the left. This is where you can find all of the tools that you have access to inside of Illustrator. And this one right here is called the Rectangle tool. If I click on that, then I've got these little crosshairs showing up on my mouse instead of the pointer tool that I was on. What this allows me to do is click and drag. And just like that, if I click and drag and let go, I've made a box that size. I can do this multiple times, make as many different shapes as I'd like using that rectangle tool. So that's great. And let's say that I don't like all of these rectangles. I want to get rid of some of them. Well, I'm going to switch to a different tool, this top left one, the arrow, called the Selection tool. And I'll click on that, and that allows me to select any one of these rectangles at a time. So I don't like these 3 rectangles right here. So I'm going to select the first one and just press delete to get rid of it. Do that same thing for these 2, and I'm left with this main rectangle. Now another thing this selection tool allows you to do is click and drag an object to reposition it. So I can move it around. And you'll notice that I have all these little squares on the corners and in the midpoints of each side of my rectangle. These are the transform controls. So if I were to grab, say, the top middle one, click and drag down or up, I'm able to resize my box. And this little pop-up with the width and height in pixels is showing up, so I can know exactly how big or small I'm making this rectangle. And I should point out that I have my units set to pixels right now. The web document defaults to displaying everything in pixels. You can use inches, millimeters, centimeters, lots of different units, but for our purposes, for motion graphics especially, we're going to be working with pixels. If I were to grab one of the other handles, maybe the top left one, this allows me to resize both the width and height at the same time. So I can reposition and resize this however I want just using that selection tool. And you see that if I click off of it, anywhere off of that object and not on top of any other object, will deselect what you had selected. Now there's some other shape tools that we have access to, and if you take a look at the tools real nice and close, you see that some of them have this little arrow in the bottom right corner. That's letting you know that there are multiple tools underneath that button. And to see the other tools, you just click and hold on any one of those tools, and then you have access to everything in that category. So these are all of the shape tools. We just looked at the rectangle tool. Again, I'm holding down the mouse this entire time. I've just clicked and held down on that button, and now I'm dragging my mouse over to make my selection. The next one I want to take a look at is the ellipse tool. So if I, with my mouse over that tool, I'm going to let go, and now my crosshair looks exactly the same, but you can see that I'm on the ellipse tool right here in my tools palette. This tool allows me to do the very similar thing as the rectangle tool. I can click and drag anywhere, and instead of a rectangle, I'm now getting an ellipse. Now, this could be very useful for making something like a perfect circle, but that might be really hard to do if I was just eyeballing it. Like, this is kind of close, but I'm not 100% sure that that's a perfect circle. So an easy way to get a perfect circle is just while clicking and dragging, hold down Shift on the keyboard. And that is going to give you a perfectly round circle. So I'm going to make a circle about this big and let go with my mouse and then let go with the keyboard. It's important that you do it in that order, because if I were to hold this, click and drag to make another rectangle, or another ellipse rather, hold down Shift and then say, okay, I like that size, and then I let go of Shift and then click. Look at that, my circle is no longer perfect because that modifier key, that Shift key, was let go before the mouse. So Illustrator assumed I didn't want to keep it a perfect circle anymore. All right, so I'm going to delete that. And that goes the same for the rectangle tool, by the way. If I were to switch back to that, click and then hold down Shift, I'm going to get a perfect square instead of just a free-form rectangle. All right, I'm going to get rid of those two, delete, switch to my selection tool, click on that other circle and delete. And let's take a look at some other options. I'm going to hold down on that shape tool again and come down to the polygon tool. This one's really fun. If I click and drag, it allows me to make a polygon. And if I hold Shift, there we go, it's going to make it not perfectly symmetrical. By default, it is symmetrical, but instead it's going to put one of the edges flat on the ground. So that way I can keep it nice and straight. I'll let go, and that went off my canvas a little bit, so I'm going to switch to my selection tool, click and drag it over so I can see it nice right on my canvas. Now we have some interesting options with some of these shapes inside of Illustrator that make them really powerful. For instance, with this polygon, I have the ability to control the number of sides. So right now there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sides to this polygon. But if we take a look right here, we have this extra little diamond shape on our bounding box for our transform controls. And when I hover over it, it has a plus and a minus. If I click and drag on this, see that I have an overlay that says sides. And as I go up or down, this is increasing or decreasing the number of sides on the polygon. So I could go down to 3 and have a triangle, and that's great. Or I could increase it. If I click and drag, I could add up to 11, it looks like. So that's really, really handy. Let's say I want a triangle. I'm going to move that all the way down to 3 and call that good. And now I want to talk about another panel that we haven't really paid any attention to yet, and that's over here on the right side of the screen, the Properties panel. This one is really, really handy and super nice because it has different properties within it that are kind of most convenient or most used based on what you have selected and which tool you have active. So in this case, I have a triangle selected, which is a polygon, and I have my selection tool selected. So up here we have the transform controls. Now we'll get into what all of these numbers are in just a little bit. But if you come down to these bottom three little circles, it says more options. I'm going to click on that, and that's going to give me even more controls over this shape. So first of all, this slider up here is the number of sides. So just like I was adjusting them right here, I can click and drag to increase this to as many as I want, even past the limit of 11 that we had right here on the controls. So I could either drag this to any number, or I could say I want a pentagon, so I know that's 5 sides. I just type that in right here and press enter. Now I have a pentagon. I also could have clicked on these little arrows up and down to increase or decrease. So that's really, really handy. And let's say that you forgot to hold shift when you were drawing this shape. I'll just delete it. Switch back to my polygon tool, click and make sure it's at an angle, so something that's not quite perfect. All right, so we've got that. Let's go back to our transform controls and look. Right here we have this angle. See, it has these 2 lines connected by that round arc. And if I highlight over it, you can see that it says rotate, and we have these big long numbers, but it's measured in degrees. This is telling you the rotation of the shape. So it's right now at 257 degrees. I could just select this entire number, type in 0 and press enter, and now it's rotated back to being at 0 degrees. So that's one way that you can transform your object. Okay, and now there's one other shape tool that I want to go over, the star tool. If I click and hold on that button again, go down to the star tool, I can click and drag to make a star. And again, holding shift will make sure that it's nice and straight up and down. Now I'll let go of that. And we don't have nearly as many options over here in the transform controls as we did with the polygon. Some shapes within Illustrator have more options and are a little bit more adjustable than others. The polygon is probably one of the most adjustable. The star tool, unfortunately, just isn't. We don't have any controls over the number of points after we've drawn it or anything about the shape. But there are some modifier keys that you can hold down while drawing a star in order to kind of shape the way that it looks before you actually let go of the mouse and have it appear on your document. So I'm going to delete this one and then click and drag again. Now I'm going to hold down shift to make that straight up and down again, but I'm also going to hold down Option or Alt on a PC. And you can see as I let go and hold that again, it's bringing all of those points in, so we have these nice straight angles on all of those points. So that's just a little bit different shape of a star. Again, remembering you have to keep those modifier keys held down until you let go of the mouse. All right, so that's one way that you can adjust stars before you draw them. I'm going to delete one more time and then click and drag again, hold shift. And actually, I can't hold shift because I need my hand to go to a different part of the keyboard. The arrow keys up and down, if I press the up key, will add another point for every time you press it. So I can keep adding points. I can press down to remove points, get back down to a star. I can even go back down to a triangle. Now, typically I wouldn't use the star tool to make a triangle since the polygon tool is better at it, but you do have the ability to go down to 3 points. Let's say that I'm fine with the 5-point star, but I don't like the way the points on the inside are positioned. Now, I already showed you to hold down Option, that will bring them all into a straight point, but what if that isn't good enough for me? Well, if I hold down Command or Control on a PC and then drag, see that this allows me to kind of stretch out the outer points of the star to go either further out like this or bring them in closer. I could even go in a negative direction so that we've kind of got an inverted star. And this is a little bit finicky. If I hold down shift, it'll keep it constrained. I don't really enjoy using the star tool in this way, but it is important to know so that if you ever do need to adjust that, you have that at your disposal. You know how to do it. I'm going to leave it just like that and actually hold down Option instead of Command so I get that straight edge star again. I like the way that looks, but let's say that I don't like how small it is. I want to scale it up. Well, I'm going to switch back to my selection tool. So I get my transform controls around the star again, and then I'm going to click and drag on that bottom right corner, but this is going to mess with the proportions. I want to scale it up proportionately, so again, that shift modifier key, just like drawing a perfectly proportional shape, will let you scale up or down proportionately. So I'm going to scale this up a little bit, and there we go. I've got my circle, my rectangle, my star, and my polygon. These are kind of the fundamental tools for drawing objects in different shapes inside of Illustrator. So it's important to know how to use them. Now that we've kind of gotten an overview of all that, let's actually make something, because this is kind of boring just putting shapes on a canvas. I want to delete everything at once, so with my selection tool, I'm going to just click and drag a box around everything. Now it doesn't even have to contain the entire shape. As long as it's touching part of the object, it will be selected. So I'm going to click and drag around all of these, and then just press delete. That way my canvas is cleared off again, and I can have a fresh start. Now, I want to make kind of a poster or an icon, a graphic for some of my favorite foods. So I'm going to do something really simple, which is a hot dog. How am I going to do that using basic shapes? Well, I'm going to start with the rectangle tool. Believe it or not, typically you think of a hot dog having roundness to it, but you'll see where I'm going as I'm doing it. So I'm going to start by clicking and dragging to make a rectangle for the bun. So about this size, I'd say it looks pretty good. And take a look at the corners of my rectangle. Right here on the inside, I have these little circles with dots inside of them. These are my corner rounders. It's what allows me to round off corners of any point. So if I deselect by selecting the selection tool, clicking off, you can see that I just have these 90-degree angle, right-angled corners on my rectangle. But if I were to select that object and then click and drag on this tool, you can see that it's allowing me to round the corners of my rectangle. I can only go up to a certain point before they turn red, and it's letting me know you can't round it any further than that. I'll let go, and that's because these corners are running into each other. So that's why I can't make them any bigger than that. So that's great. If I click off of this, now I kind of have this pill shape, which I think is going to be perfect for one of the buns. But I want my hot dog to actually have color. Right now this is just a white shape with a black outline. So let's take a second and talk about colors and how they work inside of Illustrator. I'm going to zoom in nice and close, pressing Z on the keyboard, and then scrubbing in, clicking and dragging to get nice and close, so we can take a look at this shape and what it's made up of. So even though my background is white, this canvas is white, there's actually nothing in that. Illustrator's just giving me this as a reference, kind of like a blank page so that I can see something behind my artwork. But if I come up to View and go all the way down to Show Transparency Grid, my background goes away and I have this checkerboard pattern in the background. This is the universal way within Adobe applications to represent transparency or having nothing there. Since it can't actually show me through to the background into my desktop, it's just representing that there is nothing there in the background using this checkerboard pattern. So anytime you see that, you can know that that is transparency or see-through, basically. There's nothing there. But my little rectangle, my pill shape, still has that white color on the inside and the black color on the outside. And the reason for this is because objects within Illustrator can have a fill, a stroke, or both. And I'll break down exactly what that means right now. So a fill color is what you'd imagine it is. It is the inside of the object, whatever shape that you've drawn, it's the color within it. So I've got this rounded rectangle shape. On the inside is my fill color of white. The stroke is just another word for an outline. So that's why I have a black outline around my shape. That is the stroke color. And you can adjust things like the size, the color, and even the shape of that stroke, but we'll get into that a little bit later. How do we change the colors of these two things though? Well, with this selected, taking a look over in my tools palette, we have these two squares. Now one is kind of solid and the other one is an outline. And as you might have guessed, the first one is the fill color. I highlight over it, you can see fill. And the background one is the stroke color. So the outline is an outline square. The fill is a solid fill. And you can see that those two colors are showing up exactly as they are on my object. So this is indicating, it's telling me the fill color for what I have selected is white, and the stroke color for what I have selected is black. So how do I change this? Well, it's very simple. All I have to do is double click on whichever one I want to change, and Illustrator opens up what it calls a color picker. This is how you can adjust colors inside of most Adobe applications. So I'm going to choose something else by clicking and dragging my little circle icon in this big box of color. So if I drag it over here, we've got a whole bunch of different numbers changing down here. We've got a color up here. So don't worry about all of these numbers right now. You don't need to worry about it. They will be helpful later on when we're trying to get very specific colors. But all you really need to pay attention to is this box right here. This is telling you what the color currently is and what you're going to be changing the color to. So I want to make this a hot dog bun color, but all I have access to right now is red. There's really nothing in here other than red. I can have, white. If I bring it all the way down, I can have black, but otherwise I just have like a dark red, a light red. I don't have much control over changing the actual color. Well, that's what this little rainbowy bar right here is for. You can see that we have these two arrows right down at the bottom. This is letting me know that I'm looking at the reds on the color spectrum. So I can do a very light pale red, I can do a very bright vibrant red, or somewhere in between. It's very, very accurate and allows you to be very specific. But if I were to click and drag on these two arrows, you see that all of these colors are shifting. It's adjusting the hue of my colors in this spectrum so that I can pick something else. Now I know that I need to make my hot dog bun somewhere in the orangey, maybe yellowy part of the spectrum. So I'm going to move my arrows right around there. And then I think I want something right up in here. So I'm just going to click once there and take a look at my preview. Now that is a little bit too much like sand. I want to make this a little bit more vibrant. So I want to make it more saturated. I want it to have more of a pop of color to it. And to do that, I'm just going to move my picker over to the right. This left and right movement is how you add or remove saturation. So the less saturated it is, the more pale it becomes, or the more white or gray it becomes. You're taking color out as you remove saturation. Moving to the right is the opposite. You're adding in a lot of color. It's making it more vibrant. So I think I want to do something right about there for the bun. And we can always adjust this later. So I'm just going to leave it there for now and call it good and click OK. And there we go. Now my hot dog bun has that fill color. I'm going to go ahead and turn that transparency grid back off. And another way that you can do this instead of coming up to view is actually take a look at the properties panel. When I deselected, I clicked it on my artboard there, my properties panel updated to give me lots of different view options. Right here under rulers and grids, this third button is click to hide transparency grid. That is how you can easily turn that on and off. You don't have to remember any keyboard shortcuts or where it is in the menu. It just shows up right there with the selection tool selected and no object selected. So very, very handy. Okay, so there's my hot dog bun. Now let's say I want to adjust the stroke. Well, I can come right over here and click on the stroke, and that's going to make it active. You see it jumped up to the front. Now when you're messing around with colors, or even different tools, different properties, sometimes other panels might pop open automatically. So right now this color panel opened up. I don't really need this here because I have access to color tools within this panel right here. So I'm just going to close it for now. But I do want to point out that instead of just double clicking on this and using the color picker, I could instead come over to my appearance tab inside of the properties panel. And here you can see that I have some similar controls. So fill and stroke, just like over here, fill and stroke, same colors, same icons. But if I double click on it, single click on it, I have some different options. This first one is my swatches. So swatches are kind of like predefined colors that you can reuse over and over again. So this is the default set that comes with any a new document in Illustrator. So I could click around this, choose something that I like, maybe something like that. It's got some, contrast to the actual fill color. And as you get used to this, you can actually build your own swatches so that you can easily access them, and you can even put them in little folders so that it's easy to just see them and know exactly what colors you want to be working with. But when I'm just having fun making something and picking colors kind of, on the spot and just coming up with something, I don't typically use swatches. That's more for when I have a very strict color palette that I'm trying to pick from, like my personal brand. I always use a certain specific set of colors, so that's what swatches are really handy for. But we also have this other option right up here. It looks like a little painter's palette. If you click on it, it's called the Color Mixer. And this is just another way to be able to adjust and mix colors other than the color picker. So we have 3 different sliders with lots of different colors, and it's a little bit confusing, but it's something that is important to understand as you're getting into design, especially on the computer. So we have 3 sliders labeled R, G, and B. Anything in the color spectrum on a computer is mixed with red, green, and blue values. So that's what R, G, and B stands for. In the mixer part of this tool allows you to just click and drag to mix these different colors to see what you can come up with. So you can see that as I adjust any one of these sliders, the little hue spectrum shifts on all of the others. So if I put a lot of red in, then on my green slider, I see that I could move this over and make it much more yellow. So I'm going to click on that to add some more green. And now it looks like I could make it actually green if I turn down the red slider a little bit. I could make it blue if I turn the blue slider up. So this is one way to be able to kind of just push and pull colors between the red, green, and blue channels to mix colors. Now, like I said, prefer the color picker. I think this is the most robust tool inside of Illustrator to be able to do this because you have access to all of the same controls. Again, I don't want to overwhelm you, so we're not going to get into them now, but 9 times out of 10, I'm choosing colors using the color picker. And just one final thing about this color mixer before we move on is this big rainbowy box down here. This is similar to the color picker, but it's giving you access to the entire spectrum all at once. So you're not isolating one hue like the red channel or the any one particular part of the spectrum. You're just clicking and dragging and moving this around at random basically and picking and generating a color that way. Okay, so those are all the different ways that you can adjust colors, and there are actually more, but you don't need to worry about them right now. Like I said, I typically use the color picker. So let me go back into the color picker, grab something that I like, and maybe make it a little bit darker, a little more saturated than the actual bun, and click OK, and then deselect so we can see it. Okay, great, so we've got a little outline around the bun. But let's say that I don't like how thin that line is. Well, over here in the appearance panel with that selected, we have the stroke color, but we also have the ability to increase or decrease the width of it. So that's what these little numbers over here are. If I click on either one of these up or down arrows, so down, I have 1 point. That is the width of my line. It is now 1 point. And if I click the up arrow, it goes up. And as I click this every time, you can see that the width of that outline is getting thicker and wider. So that's some extra functionality that the stroke has that's very, very handy when you're making artwork in Illustrator. Now, I actually don't want a stroke on this shape. I don't think I'm going to need an outline, so I want to remove it. To remove it, you come over to this panel right here and find this little red slash through a white square. This is the none option for whichever fill or stroke you have selected. So if I were to click on this, the outline goes away. And if I clicked on the fill color instead, I could also get rid of that. My path for the rectangle is still there. You can see that my outline is still there. It's just empty. So there's no fill and no stroke. So you can have one or the other, both, or neither. Now, there's not really any benefit to having neither because you just have empty paths that you're never going to see. So I want to put my fill color back on. Fortunately, Illustrator remembers what the last fill color I had was right here. And I can click on that and it just puts it right back in. All right, so I'm going to close that color panel that keeps popping up on me, but I'd say that that is a pretty good start for my hot dog bun. I'm going to press Z to switch to my zoom tool and then click and drag to the left to zoom out and then reposition with the space bar. There we go. We've got my hot dog bun, at least part of it. Now I want to make the actual hot dog. So I want to switch to my selection tool. And I think I want the hot dog to be about the same shape as the bun, just maybe a little bit longer and not quite so tall. So I could drag, the rectangle out here, make another one, round off the corners, change the colors, and put it down. But that's more work than I really needed to do. I'll delete that, and instead, I want to duplicate this object. Now, you're probably familiar with the keyboard shortcut for copy and paste. It's kind of a universal keyboard shortcut of Command or Control C and Command or Control V. So I'm going to do that right now with this object selected. Command C and then Command V. And there we go, we have a duplicate of that hot dog bun. Now this pasted it kind of right in the center of my screen. If I were to have my document over to the left here and paste again, see that it pasted it right there in the center of my application again. So be aware of that as you're pasting things. I'm going to delete that, shift this over, and then select that second copy of the hot dog bun. I want to make this more of a hot dog shape. So I'm going to click and drag this down and then maybe make it a little bit wider. And you'll notice that my corner roundness was preserved. That's a very, very handy feature of the roundness feature within Illustrator. And I should point out that I could always go back and adjust this. If I was making something that didn't need as much roundness, I could still select the object, click and drag on that roundness, and make it not quite so round. Now I do want it round, so I'm going to undo and keep it like that. And I want to update the color so it's more of a hot dog color. So I'll double click on my fill color, and I think it needs to be more red. I think hot dogs are typically more red, so I'm going to move my hue slider down a little bit. And then this is a little too pink, I think, so I'm going to move it down maybe over to the darker spectrum, and then a little bit more saturation, maybe something around there. And then maybe I'll bring it just a little bit more towards the orange. Right about there. So this is where I am with the bun, and then I'm going to swap it to be this red color. Click OK. There we go. We've got my hot dog set up. So I'm going to click and drag this to be about in the center of that bun, and then let go. Cool. All right, so this is kind of like a top-down view of a hot dog, and it actually looks pretty convincing. It's very, very simple, just two rounded rectangles, but people could probably identify that as a hot dog. However, I don't want to have this top-down view looking down at the top of this hot dog. I want to have it kind of more at an angle so that you're looking at it from the side. To do this, I want to copy and paste this bun again so that I have one on top and one behind it, and I can create some depth that way. So with it selected, I'll press Command C, but this time instead of pressing Command V, I'm going to add another key into the mix. I'm going to press Command Shift V, and what that does is paste it exactly where you copied it from. So no matter where I am on this document, if I press Command Shift V, it pastes it exactly where it was originally. So I have two copies on the top now, so I'm going to delete that top one. And now that I have two of those buns exactly in the same place, I want to move the front one down. So I'm going to click and drag on this. Now, this is not very precise. I only want it to move straight down. And when I'm just clicking and dragging like this, I can kind of, easily move it to the left and right unintentionally. But that magic shift key on the keyboard, which is used for so many things in these programs, is very helpful in this situation. If I'm dragging this around freely and I hold shift, this is going to constrain my movement to only moving up and down on the y-axis, left and right on the x-axis, or at 45-degree angles. So that's very, very handy for making more precise movements. So I'm going to click and drag while holding shift and move it down, say, that far. Great, now I'll deselect that, and just like that, with three very basic shapes, I'm able to create a much more depthy looking illustration of this hot dog within the buns. And I could push this even a little bit further if I wanted to be able to see a little more of the hot dog. I'll just select the background bun, and then instead of clicking and dragging, I'm going to move it using a different method, which is just the arrow keys. If I tap the up arrow key, every time I tap it, you see that it shifts it up a little bit. If I hold down shift while doing that, it moves more quickly. So up and down, and you can also do left and right. So that's a very handy way of being able to move things around. So I think I'm going to leave the back one actually about where it was, and then click on the front bun, and then just tap that down a little bit. So there we go. We've got our hot dog inside of our hot dog bun. I think we're off to a really great start, but it needs some toppings, right? It's kind of a little bare right now. Nobody likes a plain hot dog. Actually, I kind of do. But anyway, let's put some, let's say, ketchup and mustard on it. I'm going to use a new tool to do this, and I'm even going to show you how to use an effect. So get ready. Here we go. I'm going to start by grabbing this tool right here. It's called the line segment tool. And what it allows you to do is simply draw a line. And it has no depth to it. There's no, 4 points of a rectangle or a circle or anything. It's just a single line. Now, mine defaulted to not having a fill or a stroke, so I want to add a stroke to it. A fill isn't going to do me much good on something that's just a line, so I want to have that stroke instead. So with my stroke active, I'm going to click on the color icon down here to add color to that stroke. And then I'm going to increase the width. Now, I already showed you, you can click the up arrow to increase or decrease, but again, the shift key will increase the increment. So if I click up, it's going to go in 10-point increments. And you can change your width of your stroke much more quickly that way. All right, so that's 10 points, great. But when I drew that, I wasn't holding down shift, so it didn't snap to a perfectly straight line. Fortunately, if I look over in my transform controls, we have the angle set up. It's almost at 360 degrees or 0. So all I have to do is select it, press 0, press enter, and now I've got my straight line. Now I think that's about the right thickness that I want for like a line of mustard, but I need to change the color. I'm going to use this color panel since it's open and handy. And I'm just going to increase the green a little bit, take a little blue out, push and pull this around, and I'm just doing this to show you that there are plenty of different ways to come up with colors, and sometimes whatever is the most accessible to you is the best choice. So there we go. I think that's a pretty good yellow mustard color. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And then I want to move this down, so I'll switch to the selection tool, which, by the way, when you see this little tooltip pop up over when I'm hovering over the tool, you see that in parentheses we have a letter. That is the keyboard shortcut for that tool. So this whole time I've been clicking on the selection tool, but I'm going to start using the keyboard shortcut, which is V on the keyboard. And that's going to be very, very handy. I switch between the selection tool and the zoom tool, the hand tool, all the time using my keyboard shortcuts. So V to switch to that, I'll drag a box around my line so I have it selected, and then I'll click and drag it down to be about the center of that hot dog. Okay, so now it's a little bit too wide. So I'm going to click on this point here and drag it in. And I'm going to hold down shift so that I'm only moving it left and right or up and down. But I just want to go left, or to the right rather, and bring it into the end of the hot dog. And then do the exact same thing for the other side. Holding shift, click and drag that to the end. Great. Now I don't know about your mustard streaks, but typically they don't have flat caps on the end. So I want to round those off. And you can actually do that with a stroke, similarly to the way that we did with the rectangles. So I'll have it selected and then come over to my stroke appearance inside the properties panel. Now you'll notice that this has a little line under it and it kind of highlights as I go over it. The fill doesn't, but this one does. It's kind of like a link. So if I click on that, we get the entire stroke panel. Now this is very, very complicated. There are lots of different options, but we only need to worry about a couple of the options, and actually just one. This first one right here under the weight, weight is the same thing that we have access to right here. It's the width of the stroke, but the cap is what I'm concerned with. Right now, you can see that the first one, it's called a butt cap. Now, laugh at that if you must, but for whatever reason they call it a butt cap instead of a flat cap. I don't know. But that's the butt cap, and that gives you the straight edge on the end. And I'm going to zoom in actually really nice and close here so you can see what's happening as I adjust this. See that the point of my path, right where it ends, is where that cap ends. So it's flat right up, flush against that line. Now if I go back in here, the second option under cap is round cap. So if I click on that, I get this nice semicircle right on the end of my cap. Now this is the one that I want, but I want to quickly show you the last option, which is called a projecting cap. If I click on that, you see that instead of ending at the line, we now get this extended kind of squared off cap. Now this is just important to be aware of because depending on the angles of your paths and the complexity of your artwork, you're going to want to be able to know how to switch between these things. Sometimes your artwork should have roundness to it. So in this case, my artwork is turning up pretty round, so I want round caps. I'm going to leave it at that for now. Click off and then zoom out. So great, I've got a line of mustard on my hot dog. But again, I don't know about your lines of mustard, but they're typically not perfectly straight lines. Now, there are many ways to be able to manipulate the shape of a line inside of Illustrator or any path, but I want to use something that's a little bit more precise and a lot less work than actually modifying this by hand. So I'm going to go ahead and select it and then come up to Effect, and we have a huge menu full of lots of different effects. And you can see that we have Illustrator effects and Photoshop effects. Don't worry about the Photoshop effects. We're going to get into the difference between these two categories later on in the course. For now, I don't even want you to worry about all of the different things. I'm just going to come down to Distort and Transform and find this one particular effect I want called Zigzag. Click on that, and I have this zigzag panel show up. Now nothing has changed because my preview is not checked. If I click on that, look at that, my line is now this zigzag pattern. So this effect does exactly what it sounds like. It's going to just give this nice little pattern, and I have some options to change the way that this effect is actually transforming my line. I can increase the size, and now the zigzag is much, much bigger. Probably don't want to do that. But then I also have the ridges per segment, and don't worry about what that exactly means, but if you turn it up, you can see that I just have more of these zigzags showing up within it. So I think right about there is probably good. It's this nice little squiggly thing, but I've got these sharp corners, and again, that isn't really what mustard would come out of the bottle looking like. But fortunately, I have this points option right down here, which right now is set to corner. Instead, I want to select smooth. And look at that. Now I've got this nice wavy line, kind of like somebody just squirted on the mustard and wiggled their hand really fast. So I'm going to turn the ridges per segment down just a little bit. And I think that looks pretty good. I'll click OK. And what's great about this Illustrator effect is that it updates. So if I were to trim this down, it's going to move with my line. So I can adjust that however I want, and it's going to be able to update no matter what. Now this mustard is showing up on top of my bun right now, and I don't want that. I want, that's kind of killing the perspective of it. I want it to live only on top of the hot dog and this bun to be on top of the line. And to do that, we're going to talk about a new panel, which we haven't looked at yet. But right up here, if you look at the top of the panels, the properties panel, we have multiple tabs. And these are just like tabs inside of a browser. It allows you to organize panels inside of this program so that you don't necessarily look at everything all at once, but you can get to it if you want. What I want to get to is the layers palette. So that's the second one right here. I'm going to click on it. My properties panel goes away, and I have this new panel. Now it doesn't look like much, but this is how you determine how your objects are on top or behind each other within your document. So I have layer 1 right here. I only have one layer in my document, but inside of that layer, I have all of these objects here, the two buns, the hot dog, and the mustard. And this little drop-down arrow right here, if I click on it, it will twirl down and show me 4 different objects. So what are these objects? I'm going to expand this out a little bit so we have more room to read. And what this is showing me all of the different objects within that layer, which are these 4 objects that we just listed out. So right here we have a rectangle. This little circle right here is called the target. If I click on it, it's going to make a selection of that object. So we have a rectangle path for that bun in the background. Even though the corners are rounded, its basic shape was a rectangle, so that's why Illustrator labeled it rectangle. Then we have a duplicate of that rectangle, so it's also named rectangle. That's for the hot dog. We have another bun, and then we have a line for the mustard. Now, to make this a little bit easier to look at inside of Illustrator and identify, I can actually rename these objects. So the bottom rectangle is the back bun. So I'm going to double click on the word rectangle and name it back bun. And I'll press enter to apply it. And then I'll do the same thing for the hot dog. I'll call this hot dog. Then we've got the front bun. And I knew that was the front bun because I'm looking at this little icon right here, this square. It's giving me a preview of what the object is. So that's how we know that's the bun. And then finally we have the line. I'll double click on this and call it mustard. And now I can just much more easily identify what I'm looking at. So if I want to make a selection without clicking on the object, I could just say, I want the hot dog. And I target it, and there's my selection. I could also, again, hold that magic shift key to make selections of multiple objects. I'm holding shift and clicking on these targets, and that adds to my selection. That works exactly the same way with your selection tool in here. I could select the back bun, hold shift, select the front bun, and then move them together if I wanted. Just click and drag, move them around. So that's very, very helpful to be able to move things around together or independently. I'm going to undo by pressing Command or Control Z. And one more time. That is a keyboard shortcut that you should also get used to. You could go up to Edit, Undo, but instead I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut of Command or Control Z. And by the way, if you want to redo, if I undid too many times, you see that my layers are now no longer renamed. I could press Command Shift Z and press that again and again and again to redo until I get back to where I want. So Command Z to undo, Command Shift Z to redo. All right, so now all of this is labeled properly. But another part of the layers palette that really helps us out is that the stacking order, the order of these layers, equals the visual order on your screen. So think of these objects like pieces of paper, as if I had cut these out of construction paper and I have them all on top of each other. If I put the front bun piece of paper behind the hot dog, then it's going to show up behind the hot dog naturally. And if I put the mustard behind everything, I'm not going to see it because those other three pieces of paper on top of it have made it disappear. So the stacking order inside of the layers is exactly like that stacking order of paper. I want the back bun to be on the bottom. I want the front bun to be on the top. And I want the mustard to be above the hot dog. So there we go. We can see visually the stacking order is correct because the stacking order is correct in my layers palette. And as I was moving that around, all I did was click on which object I wanted, hold down on it, and then drag it up or down in the list. And you can see this little blue highlight line is telling me where it's going to go when I let go of my mouse. So I can put it at the top, let go. I can move it back down where it needs to go, let go. And you can do that with multiple layers. I hold shift to make a selection of both of those, move them around. It's very customizable in that way. Okay, so I think my hot dog is actually done, ready to go. So I'm going to zoom out here, and then let's talk about placement a little bit. This is kind of in an obscure place in the document. It looks a little bit off to the right. It's not centered. So I want to center it up in the document. And how do I do that very precisely? Well, there's some really handy tools to be able to do that inside of Illustrator. So if I were to just grab this and kind of move it down, it's not going to be very precise. It's not going to fit right in the center exactly just by eye. If I go over to my Properties panel, the Transform box here is going to give me some indicators as to how close I was. So on this left side, we have an X and a Y value. And remember, X is the horizontal axis and Y is the vertical axis. And then we have some numbers in pixels. So what these numbers are telling me is how far away the center of my selection is from the origin of the artboard. So what does that mean? Well, the origin of any artboard is the top left corner. So right up here, that is a pixel value in the relationship of this document of 0 on the X and 0 on the Y. So this Properties panel is measuring my selection from that corner in pixels to the center of my selection. So right in the middle here, it's 299 pixels on the X horizontal axis and 381.604 on the Y. Now, my document is 600 pixels wide. So halfway in the center point, halfway through it, should be 300 pixels, half of 600. And I'm at 299. So I was only 1 pixel off. So I was very, very precise, even with just my eye and my mouse, but I can be 100% precise if I double click on this number and type in 300 and then press enter. And now it just shifted over just 1 pixel, and now I know that is perfectly aligned to the center of my document. Great. Now I could do the same thing for the Y. It's 800 pixels tall. Half of that would be 400. So I can just type in with that number selected, 400, press enter, And there we go. It shifted my entire selection as a whole down to the center of the document. And I know for a fact that is perfectly centered. But let's say that you were working on a document that wasn't so perfectly round numbers like 800 by 600. For instance, 1920 by 1080 is the standard full HD resolution for video. So that's something you'll be working with a lot as a motion designer. And dividing that by 2 in your head might not be as easy. Now, eventually, believe me, you will know that by heart. But Illustrator and most Adobe applications allow us to do a little math, almost using the program like a little pocket calculator. So let's say I just move this off center again. We take a look at the transform. Instead of typing in 300 on the X, I could instead just say 600, which is the width, and then press divided by that backslash 2. Because 600 divided by 2 is half the width, and press enter. And Illustrator is smart enough to interpret that as a calculation and update it for you. I can do the same thing on the Y. 800 divided by 2, and now I know it's centered again. All right, there's one more way to be able to align your objects to other parts of the document. So I'm going to come up to Window and open up one more panel, and it's right here, Control. Click on that. And we've got a bunch of tools up here at the top now. Now, a lot of them do kind of overlap with the Properties panel, but you don't have to concern yourself with stuff that you're not looking for. All I want to deal with right now are these set of buttons right up here with all these rectangles and lines. This is the Align palette. You can have a standalone Align palette. By the way, if you go to Window, all of the panels for Illustrator exist here. So if you're looking for something very specific, if the Properties panel isn't showing you the controls that you're looking for, you can find all of those panels right here under Window. So like I said, I could open the Align palette, but then I've got this floating panel. I could dock it somewhere, but I don't want to really concern myself with all that. These buttons up here are going to be just fine, and I like this little bar right at the top. So what does this Align palette do? Well, it lets you align objects to either the artboard or other objects. So this button right here is a little drop down that allows you to choose what you're aligning to. By default, it's on Align to Artboard. So with all of these objects selected, I could align them to the left edge. You see that shifted the left edge of every object to the left edge of the document. So they're no longer centered with each other. I'll select them again, and I can do the same thing to the bottom. I can align it to the bottom of the document, to the top, but this is messing with my artwork in a way that I didn't want. So I'm going to undo Command or Control Z, so I'm back to my regular hot dog. And to prevent that kind of individual object shifting around from happening when you're aligning things, all you need to do is group them. To do that, you just come up to Object, Group, and now if I deselect and then click once, it's selecting all of my objects as a whole. And if I take a look at the Layers palette, I now have a group with a little twirl down that has all of my objects perfectly labeled the way that they were. But now Illustrator is first looking at this as a whole before it's looking at the individual objects. So I can again move this off to the center, off center, and then click on the horizontal align center and the vertical align center buttons. And there we go again with just 2 simple clicks, it's centered in my document. If I want to ungroup these objects, all I have to do is come up to Object, Ungroup, and there we see in our layers, those objects are split up again. I can move them around individually. Keyboard shortcut for group and ungroup is also really easy to remember. Command or Control G and Command or Control Shift G to group and then ungroup. That's something that you'll likely be doing a lot, so get used to that keyboard shortcut as well. All right, now that this is centered up in the document, let's add some more style to the actual artwork because, again, right now this white background is actually just transparent pixels. I'm going to show my pixel grid, going to Properties and clicking on that. There's nothing behind the hot dog. So I've made one object, one part of my design. Let's flesh this design out a little bit more by adding in a background. I want to make a rectangle that's the exact size of the document. So I could grab this rectangle tool and again just kind of eyeball it and do my best to get that to align to the bounds of my art box, but obviously I was not precise. That you can see is going beyond it, but if I have it selected, the Properties panel is also going to help us out with this. Right next to the X and Y values, I have the width and height values. So I could just as easily type in 600 on the width, press Tab to go to the next property, 800 on the height, and press Enter. Now I know it's perfectly the right size of the document, and then I'll just click on the horizontal and vertical center align buttons up here in my controls. Great, so that's now perfectly the size of my box. I just need to move it down below everything else because it's covering everything up. It's at the top of the layer stack. So I'm going to drag it down below everything else. And then I'll rename it BG for background and just double click on the text to rename a layer. Okay, so that's good, except that it's the exact same color as the bun. So that's not really going to work because it makes the bun go invisible. So I want to select it and then change the color to something a little bit different. So maybe a blue color for the background, something in this range. I'm just going to shift my hues to the blues and then adjust the saturation and brightness. Click OK. And that looks pretty good, but it's kind of bright. It's kind of almost competing with the bun. And if we look at the edge real close, it's almost a little hard to look at that edge. This is a common issue to come up when you're picking colors, and you need to be aware of it because picking certain color combinations next to each other, right up against each other like this, can actually be hard to look at and strain your eyes. And a lot of times this is because your two colors are too similar in value, and value is brightness. This is a basic design principle that, again, you need to get used to thinking about, and as you use Illustrator and Photoshop, things like that, to design your own artwork, you'll get much more used to thinking about color in this way and be able to identify problems like this. So I'm going to grab that blue color and then double click on this again to look at my color picker. Some of these values can help us in choosing better color combinations when we have issues like this. So if we take a look at this B right here, the B stands for brightness, which is synonymous with value. So right now it's telling me that it is 91% brightness. If I hit OK and then click on the bun's color and go into it, can look that the brightness of the bun color is also 91%. So just like I had guessed, it's because these two colors are too similar in value that they are not working so well next to each other. So I'm going to go into the blue and maybe adjust it a little bit. I'll turn it down, maybe increase the saturation a little bit, and then maybe even make it just slightly more green. Something like that. I'll click OK and see how that's updated. I think that is much easier to see. It might even be a little bit too bright still, so let me grab it one more time, bring it down, click OK, and I think that's a lot better. Maybe we want to adjust this in just a little bit, but for now, I think that color is working with the color of the buns much better. All right, now I want to add kind of like a frame around the entire artwork. So I'm going to select that object again, and this time I'll do it with a stroke. So I'm going to make my stroke active by clicking on it, and then click on the color. This is just going to add the last color I used, which is blue. Obviously that's not going to work because you can't see it, so I'll double click on it and make it just nice pure white. Now, I don't know that this is the color that I'm going to want to go with, but for now, just so I can get a sense of the border, I'm going to leave it at that. Okay, so that stroke is really, really thin. I'll zoom in here nice and close so we can see it, but it's really, really small because the stroke is only 1 point. So I'm going to increase that, hold down Shift and click on this top arrow, and that will make it much bigger. Now it's 10 points instead of 1. And I think I want to make it even a little bit bigger. So maybe about that thickness, 30 points. And I want to point out something. The black box here is the edge of my artboard. You can see that the stroke is going beyond it. The stroke right now is aligned to the center of my rectangle path. But if I open up the stroke panel by clicking on the little stroke words, you can see that we have this align stroke section, and right now it's aligned to the stroke, align the stroke to the center of the path. But we also have the option to align to the inside, so it's only staying on the inside of that path, or the outside. Now I want it to be on the inside because right now it's outside of the artboard and we'll never see it when we export it. So I'm going to align that to the inside and call it good. Let's take a look at this as a whole. I think that's a pretty decent sized frame for the entire thing. Great. Now I want to add a little bit more depth to my image. So one way that I could do that is by adding a shadow underneath the hot dog. And it doesn't have to be a super realistic shadow, but something just to give the sense of a ground plane that it's sitting on and a little bit of lighting. And I'm going to do this with, you probably guessed, a rectangle. So I'm going to get rid of the stroke before I even draw anything. I'll just click on the none. And then I'm going to make the fill just pure black, 100% black. Click OK. And there's actually a shortcut right here. I could have just clicked on this little black square here, white, black, or none. Those are just handy shortcuts. All right, now I want to draw a rectangle about the width of the hot dog. And this is actually really hard to see because my outline is blue and the background is blue. So I'm actually going to undo that, go into my layers, and point out that if you double click on a layer, not the layer text, but any other part of the layer, this will bring up layer options. And right now the color, which you can even see right here, is light blue. But I could change this to say light red, click OK, and now when I draw something, I'm going to see a red outline, and it's much easier to see what I'm doing. Okay, so I've got my rectangle, but I don't like where I started it. Well, here's another really helpful use of the keyboard for when you're drawing objects. If you hold down the space bar while drawing, you can temporarily reposition that box wherever you want to put it. So I'm going to try and align it with the left edge. I'm looking right here, the left edge of this hot dog, and then bring it down, and then draw this over to the right edge of the hot dog, and probably put it right about there. Great, now I just want it to be centered perfectly in my document, so I'll align it on the horizontal center. And then I need to move it below the hot dog, but above the background. So I'll click and drag down below the hot dog and rename this Shadow. Then I want to round off all of the corners, so I'm going to zoom in close so I can see those corner rounders, and then click and drag to just round it off, make that nice pill shape. I think I want to make it a little bit taller so that I can see a little more coverage of that entire hot dog. It was a little too short at first. Round those corners off again. I think that's about the right shape, but it doesn't really look like a shadow right now because it's pure 100% black, and shadows never look like that. So I could try to, mix the colors a little bit to make it more similar to the background, but this is kind of hard to do. That's all right, but it's more saturated than I like. There's a much easier way to do this inside of Illustrator, and that is through opacity. And the opacity is a term that you need to understand in relationship with transparency. If you don't already know, if something is opaque, 100% opaque, then you cannot see through it at all. It is 100% solid, nothing shows through it. And 100% transparency is the opposite. You can see through it. You don't see the object itself at all. It's completely clear. So you can lower the opacity or increase the transparency to make something see-through. And if I click on this object and come over to Properties and look at the Appearance panel, I have Fill, Stroke, and Opacity. It's at 100%, but if I click on this arrow, I have a slider that I can turn down, and that adjusts the opacity, introducing transparency to this object, and I'm seeing that blue color of the background through it. So I'm going to turn this way down, probably something down to like 8. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. And now I have a pretty decent looking shadow that adds a good amount of depth to this otherwise pretty flat artwork. Now I want to do something to make the background a little bit more interesting instead of just having this solid blue color. So I'm going to try and make kind of like split this in half so that half of it is a little bit darker than the other half in this kind of angled way. So it's like this split tone background. To do that, I want to first duplicate this object. So the background object, I'll go into my layers and then click and drag it down to the new layer button to have a new instance of it. I'm going to call this BG2. And I want to, like I said, cut it right diagonally from the top right to the bottom left so it's a triangle instead of a rectangle. To do that, I'm going to need to remove the top left point so that we don't have a corner up here. To do this, I'm going to use the Direct Selection tool. This is a tool we have, up until now, have not used, but you'll notice it's right next to the Selection tool, and the only difference really is that this is filled with white and the Selection tool is filled with black. So if the Selection tool allows you to grab an object or any group of objects and move them around or transform them, the Direct Selection tool allows you to grab any point on an object and click and drag and move it around. So I have two objects, two instances of this background on top of each other, so it's a little hard to see. So let me undo and move this over temporarily and do this again. If I grab my Direct Selection tool, I can make a selection of just the top left corner, and it's filled in. The other points have white fills. So that's how I know this one's selected. I can click and drag it around freely. So it's no longer just a perfect rectangle. And you see this message right here that says Shape Expanded. This is Illustrator cueing you in that some of the features that you had access to from the shape tools are no longer going to be available because it's no longer the basic shape that the shape tool drew. This is most noticeable with like the polygon tool. If I apply this, we have the little control on the side to increase or decrease the number of sides, right? But if I were to grab one of these points and say move it and then do something like this, we've got that shape expanded again, and I'm no longer able to adjust how many sides are on that point, or on that path. So be aware of that. When you're manipulating these basic shapes after you've drawn them and you see that shape expanded, you're going to lose some of the nice functionality, but that's totally fine. So with this point selected, I can click and drag a box around it. I can hold Shift, click and drag another box around a different point. Now I have 2 points selected. I can move them around together. Or I could just click once on one point, hold Shift, and click on another point to make a selection. So this is how the Direct Selection tool works. And it's very, very handy for doing things like this. Now I'm going to undo back to my regular rectangle, and I'm even going to move it back to where it was. And then I just want to get rid of the stroke. Click on the none, and then change the blue color just so I can differentiate between it and the background. So there we have the darker copy on top of the lighter copy. Then I'll switch to my Direct Selection tool, A on the keyboard, that's the shortcut, and then I'll click once on the top left corner. Another thing I'll point out is that you see that now I have a corner roundness for just the one corner. So I could independently round off one corner, or I could shift click on another one, round those off too. Oops, I accidentally clicked on the path. That's something to take note of. If you click on the middle of the shape, it will select all of the paths just the same way that the selection tool does. But here we go. I'll select one point, shift click on the other point, and then round both off at once, and I kind of got this leaf shape going. So that's something very useful to know. All right, now to get rid of this point, I will select it with just one click, and I can simply press delete, and it becomes a triangle. So we've got the shape expanded Q, and this looks like it's perfectly fine, but we do have one little issue. And again, I'm going to move this off to the side to show you. I'm going to switch my view. Right now I've been looking at this with full colors, basically a preview of exactly how it's going to export, but if I come up to view and click on outline, this is just going to show me the paths with no color information. And you can see, this is the path for the back bun, the front bun, the shadow, the hot dog, and then that line of mustard. You'll notice because I did that squiggle with an effect, I still have this basic line shape for it in my outline view. And we have our artboard and then these two lines. Now, if I turn this back off, preview on GPU instead, we've got a triangle. But our outline view is only showing two lines. Why is that? Well, it's because I deleted that point, which opened up this path. It's no longer a complete closed path. It's open. There's no connection from the start to the end. This is something that's easily correctable, and it can bring up some issues if you leave your paths open like this, so it is important to know how to fix. All you have to do is go up to Object, Path, Join, and the keyboard shortcut is very easy to remember, Command or Control J. I'll click on that. That closes off the path, adds a line between those 2 points, and I have my triangle again. So I'll press Command Y, that's the shortcut for outline mode, and then click on this object and align it to the right edge of the composition, and that way I know that that's perfectly back where it needs to be. Okay, great. Now we have one other issue where it's covering up the frame. This frame is existing on the background color, so I can't just move it up or else that's going to cover up the triangle. So instead, I need to make another copy of this background. I'll click and drag it down and then rename this BG frame, move it above BG2, and then get rid of the fill. So all we have is the stroke. So I'll click on the None button, and there we go. Now I have a frame on top of the two backgrounds. Okay, that looks pretty good. I think the frame is just a little bit too thick, so I'm going to make a selection of it and then go into my stroke and turn it down to something like 20. And my background layer, this lighter blue color, still has the stroke applied, so I need to get rid of that. So I'm left with just the frame on the top. I think that's a little bit better. I like that thickness. And now I want to change this color. This was totally temporary, and really I just want it to be the same shade as our shadow is. So I want to make it exactly the same. It was black 100%, and then I think I put the opacity down to 8. Now, I could figure that out and change the color that way and try and remember, but there's a much quicker way to do that with another tool. And that is called the eyedropper tool, which the keyboard shortcut for, by the way, is I. So another one that's kind of easy to remember. So I for the eyedropper. What this does is samples whatever you click on and applies it to whatever you have selected. And what it's sampling is the actual appearance of the object. So if I switch to the eyedropper, I on the keyboard with that color selected, and I click on the red fill of that hot dog, it becomes red. If I click on the bun, it becomes the orangey color. If I click on the yellow of that mustard, you'll notice it did not fill it with yellow. It actually took the entire appearance. So the appearance of this line actually has a stroke of yellow, and then it has that zigzag effect. So it picked up both of those under the sample and applied it to this object. Now I could get around this if I really just wanted to apply it to the fill. I just wanted to take that yellow color of the stroke and apply it to the fill. I'll undo. I'll zoom in nice and close here. Switch to my eyedropper tool, hold down Shift, that magic key on the keyboard, and click on that yellow, and there we go. That's kind of a pro tip. It took me a while to figure out how to do that inside of Illustrator, but once I did, I started using the eyedropper so much more. But to be able to apply just the specific color that you're sampling to whatever stroke or fill you have active, make sure you're holding down that Shift key when you click on whatever you're sampling. Okay, so obviously yellow is not what I wanted. I want the appearance, the exact appearance of this shadow. So I'm going to click on it, and there we go. I've got that same black fill with the opacity of 8 on that duotone background. And I think that looks really great. And the benefit of this is that I could change the color of the background. Say I want it to be a little more green. I'll introduce some more green. And that shadow is going to update with it because it's just applying 8% opacity of that black on top of it. It's blending those two colors together. I'm going to undo probably right there. I like that shade of blue. All right, I like the way that everything is looking, and that way that background is angled right across this diagonal is really drawing your eye to the center of the frame without you even really realizing it. This is another design concept that is very, very handy and used all the time for directing your viewer to looking at what's most important. These vertical lines are kind of drawing your eye into the center of the document, and it's just guiding you to looking at that. And it's much more effective than just having this plain blue background with nothing interesting happening. So I'll undo to keep that, and that's just working much better that way. All right, now I just want to move the hot dog up a little bit and put a text label underneath it that just says hot dog. So I'm going to come into my layers, and I actually want to lock the background layer. So I'm going to click on the lock right here. That's this empty box right here. Locks any of these objects. Now I can't click and drag them. And then I want to make a selection of my hot dog with the shadow and then move it up a little bit. I'm going to hold Shift so I'm only moving up and down, and then move it probably about, I'd say around there. Now I want to put some text right under it that says hot dog. So I'm going to switch to another new tool, the type tool right here, this big bold T. And then I just have to click anywhere in the document once to add some text. And we get this automatic little addition right here that says lorem ipsum. And lorem ipsum is just placeholder text. It's filler, it's Latin, and it doesn't mean anything. It just is there so you can get a preview of what your text is going to look like before you even type it out. So I'm going to type in hot dog, because that's what I want to type, and I want to basically apply or confirm this text. But if I press enter, that's going to drop down a line. I don't want that. If I press V to switch to my selection tool, actually that's going to type a V. How do I get out of this? Well, I could click on any other tool or just hit the escape key, and that kind of applies the text edits that you made. All right, now let me zoom out a little bit, and this text is obviously much too small. So I'm going to grab one of the transform handles with my selection tool, click and drag while holding Shift to constrain the proportions and make it about that big. I want to move it down so it's not overlapping that shadow. And I don't like the default font that Illustrator has given me, and I don't like the color. So that's what I want to modify. I'm going to come over to my properties panel, and right here we have the character palette. This is where we can choose our typeface or our font and adjust things like the size of it. So I'm going to just click on this little drop down, and this is going to give me all of the fonts on my machine. Now, I have a whole lot of fonts, but I can easily just scrub through them and preview them. As you see, I'm just moving my mouse over them, and the text is actually updating in my document. Now, if you're curious about fonts and you want to look at more, try and find some more for your own projects, Adobe Creative Cloud actually has this really great thing called Adobe Typekit that's included in your subscription at no extra cost. And it's a huge library of really, really high quality fonts of all different kinds of styles that you can sync to your computer and use across any projects for whatever you like. All you have to do to browse them is go to Add Fonts from Typekit. So definitely check that out if you've never seen it. I want to limit my font selection to just the Typekit fonts, and that's what this button right here does. So I'm going to click on that, and I know that the font that I want to use in particular is called Azo Sans Uber Regular, and it's this really big fat font. So I'm going to click on that, and this is what it looks like. I really like that. I think it fits this artwork, so I'm going to just kind of center this up. Actually, I'm going to use my Align palette. Here we go. Click on the center. And I think that's pretty good. Maybe make it a little bit smaller, but I don't want to have to realign it to the center every time. And if I shift click to scale this down, it's scaling it to the left off center. However, there's another keyboard shortcut you can combine with the shift key when scaling something up or down. That's Option or Alt on the keyboard. Hold down Shift and Option, and that will constrain the proportions and scale it from the center instead of the side that you clicked on. Now that is universal across anything. I could scale any object that same way. Hold down Shift and Option, and that's going to scale from the center. So be aware of that as you're trying to resize things and not wanting to reposition them every time you do it. All right, that looks pretty good, but I don't like the color. So let's pick something nice and bright. Now, I could do pure white, just like the frame, but I don't really like using these super bright pure white or pure black colors. Same reason why I turned down the shadow. I think I just want to bring the brightness and of the text and the frame down a little bit, and maybe add in a little bit of color. Sometimes using these pure white and black colors just don't look that great to your eyes. And because the background is so blue, if I just introduced a little tiny bit of blue to my white, then it would blend into the entire composition a little bit better. So this time I'm going to use this color mixer, and I'm just going to pull some of the red out. 100% white is made up of pure red, green, and blue turned all the way up. If I take some of that red out, you can see that it's going to get more and more blue. And I don't need to do a lot. I don't want to make it this nice cyan color. I want to just barely take out some red. You can see that that's slightly blue now. This is what it was, and there we go. We got a little bit of blue. And that's all I wanted to do. That's really all that I need to just take off the edge of that pure white color and blend it into the rest of my document a little bit. Now I want to apply that same color to my frame, so I'll go to my layers, unlock the frame, and select it with that target. And I want to apply that color to it. Now remember, if I click on this once with the eyedropper, I for the eyedropper tool, it's going to pull the fill color of the text and completely change the appearance of my frame. And I'll show you what I mean. I click on it, and now I have a fill instead of a stroke. So I don't want to do that. I'll undo. Instead, I want to make sure that my stroke is the active selection, hold down Shift with the eyedropper, and then click on that text. And now my frame is no longer pure white. It's this nice shade of blue. I'll lock that up, zoom out, take a look at this as a whole, and I think that's working much better together. Now, I think everything is just visually a little bit too high. I'm getting kind of this weird balance tick in my brain that I'm just noticing. Everything feels a little bit top heavy, like there's too much room underneath. Now this is, as I described it, a feeling, and it's something that you're going to have to develop as a designer as you use these programs more and more often. You're going to start seeing things with your eyes and feeling if something looks right. Right now, my eyes are telling me that this does not feel right. It feels a little too off-center upwards. So I'm going to select it all and then just tap the down arrow key a few times until it's about where I think it should be. And I think it's just barely a hair too far up. I'll tap it down just a couple more. And I think that feels much more balanced. All right, I think this design is finished. I'm very happy with the way that it turned out, and just with some very basic shapes and some simple colors, I was able to make something that was visually interesting. All right, so that was a whole lot of work to get to where we are right now, and I made one really big rookie mistake, which is I have not even saved my document once. So if my computer crashed, if Illustrator crashed, I would have lost that document, no recovery. It just would have been gone. All that hard work for nothing. So I'm going to come up to File and click on Save. This is something you need to get in the habit of doing constantly. The keyboard shortcut is Command S to save, but I'm going to name this Food, put it on the desktop, and click Save. This is just a temporary holding place. I would normally store my file somewhere else, but for this, it's fine. And we're going to get these Illustrator options. Everything by default is fine, so I'm going to click OK, and now my document is saved. We can see on the tab, food.ai. .ai is the extension for Adobe Illustrator. That is the format of an Illustrator file. And I know that it is saved because there's no little star here. If I move something, then I get this little star that says, hey, you changed something and you haven't saved yet. So that's a little indicator, something to remind you that you need to be saving. And again, the keyboard shortcut is Command or Control S. Okay, now I want to make a second design really quickly, and there's going to be a lot less explanation on this one because we've covered a lot of the tools, but there are a few things that this next design is going to bring up that you should be aware of before you start making your own art. Now, in Illustrator, you can actually have multiple artboards inside one document. Think of it just like two different pieces of paper that you're working on. So I'm going to come over to my Properties panel, make sure that I've clicked on the background so nothing is selected, and I can come over here and there's a button under Document that says Edit Artboards. If I do that, we get a different view and we see a bounding box for the edges of my artboard. We see 01 Artboard 1. And over in the Properties panel, again, we have the ability to name this artboard. So I'm just going to rename it right here real quick and call this one Hot Dog. Press Enter. And then I want to make a new artboard. So this button right here, just like the New Layer button, is New Artboard. I'll click on it. And that just shifts over my view and makes another artboard right next to the original. Named it Artboard 2. I'm going to rename this one Cheeseburger. Press Enter. And if you wanted to change the size, you could type in the width and height here, you could reposition it, or you could choose from a preset even. I want it to be the same size though, so I'm going to leave it just like that. Then I'll click on the Exit button, so I'm back to my editing view. And one more thing I want to point out is that under the Document section, you can see that I'm currently on Artboard 2. If I click this little arrow, it shifts over to Artboard 1. And this is important to know because if I was trying to align this object over on this artboard, clicking this horizontal align center button isn't going to do that for me because I'm currently on the Artboard 1. That is my active artboard. All I have to do to switch artboards is either click that button or click on the artboard. You see that we just got a little tiny black thin frame indicating which artboard you're on depending on which one you've clicked on. So that's something to be aware of. Okay, so now that I have this identical artboard right to the side, I want to kind of duplicate what I have over here onto this document. I want it to be based on the exact same design. And I'm actually going to do this on a separate layer. Again, if you remember, everything is contained on this one layer for this artwork. So I'm going to rename this one Hot Dog, just like I renamed the artboard for it. And then I'm going to duplicate it by clicking and dragging down to the New Layer button. And I'll rename this one Cheeseburger. And then I want to select everything in it and move it over. But I need to make sure first that I unlock the background objects. So I'll unlock those, click on my target, and then move these over. Now, this again is not very precise. So I'm going to go over to my Properties panel and take a look at the transform controls. Now, this is not what I expected. These numbers are very, very large, and that's because I'm currently still on the first artboard. It's referencing the top left origin point of the first artboard. So I need to deselect, make sure I go to the second artboard, then make a selection of that layer, go back to my Properties panel, and here we go. My X is already correct. Y is 401. I'll press or type in 400 there, hit enter, and now it's all aligned perfectly. Okay, now I can make some adjustments. I want to probably change the text. That's an easy one. I'll press T on the keyboard and then double click to edit, actually triple click to edit all of the text in there. That makes a selection of everything. I could click and drag to make partial selections. I could use my left and right arrow keys to move in between letters. I could drag a selection around everything, double click once to select a word, and triple click to select everything. So we'll get more into typography a little bit later. If I went really fast, don't worry, you don't have to remember all of that right now. But I triple click to get a highlight of everything, and I'll rename this cheeseburger. Okay, so I'll press escape to apply that and then center it up in my document. There we go. And now I need to start modifying my art. I'm going to go to my layers so I don't accidentally edit this hot dog layer, and I'll lock it. That way I don't mess it up at all. And take a look at this cheeseburger layer. The elements that make this up, I want to modify the colors a little bit. The background is blue right now. I think I want to make it red. Something that still seems like it would go with this blue over here, but red instead. So I'm going to have that selected, go into the color picker, and then just shift the hue down to something a little bit more red. Maybe a little orangey red and maybe a little less saturated. Something around there. Click OK. And there we go. We've got a red background. I think that works. Now, I don't need this hot dog artwork anymore, so I'm just going to make a selection. Actually, I need to make sure I lock the background first. There we go. I'm left with that, and I'm just going to delete. I don't need that because I'm going to be building a cheeseburger from scratch instead. So I'm going to start with the bottom bun, and just like with the hot dog, I'm going to use the rectangle tool to do this. So I'm just going to drag a rectangle out about the size of the bun that I want, hold the space bar to reposition, and actually just perfectly align it in the center like that. And I want to make it the same color as the hot dog bun. So press I on the keyboard to get the eyedropper tool and then select that bun. And then I want to make it probably a little bit thicker. So just switch to the selection tool and make it a little taller. There we go. And this time, instead of rounding off all of the corners, I just want to round off the bottom two. So I need to switch to my direct selection tool, A on the keyboard, drag a box around these 2 points, which again, this is hard to see because I have a red background and my label is red. So I need to double click on the layer and I'll change this one back to light blue. There we go. Now it's easier to see. Okay, so I make a selection and I want to round off just these 2 corners. So I'm going to round it, and maybe not 100%, but maybe something around there, just so it has some rounded corners to it. So that's great. And then what comes next? Probably the burger patty. So I'll grab my rectangle tool again, and I could try to eyeball this, line it up so that it's just right up against the edge, but just like everything else, it's not going to be very precise when I'm doing it by eye. But there is another really, really handy tool that's going to make this much better. So I'm going to delete that and come up to View and go down to Smart Guides. Keyboard shortcut for this one is Command U. The U doesn't really make sense for this one. It probably was just Adobe running out of space on the keyboard, but it is something that I'm constantly turning on and off to help me, so that's one that you should also start learning. So I'm going to turn that on, and immediately you'll notice that things are starting to show up as I hover over them. I've got some magenta text showing up, and the outlines of the objects are also appearing. If I unlock this artwork, you can see the outlines of every shape are showing up as I hover over them. If I click on an object and try and move it around, I get a bunch of magenta lines letting me know that it's trying to line that object up, basically snapping it to other parts of your artwork or your document. I'll lock that hot dog back up and actually turn it off for now so that the smart guides aren't interacting with the artwork over there, but this is going to very easily allow me to draw an object right up against that edge, perfectly aligned. So let me grab that rectangle tool again and highlight over. You can see that word path has shown up. That's letting me know that it's going to start the object right on the edge of that path. So I can click and drag this up, make it the size that I want, even hold down space bar and reposition it so that it's about the width of the bun, and call that good. So now I can know that with perfect certainty that is exactly on the edge up against the bun. Great. Now I just need to change the color. So this needs to be something probably like a dark brown, and maybe add a little bit of red into it, something like that. Click OK. I think that looks pretty good. And then I want to round off the corners, and this time I'll do all 4. So I'll just grab it with the selection tool, round off the corners, and then actually, you know what? I think I want the bun to go, or the patty to go further than the bun. So I'm going to decrease the size of this rectangle. So I'll select it, hold down Option or Alt, click on the right middle transform control, and that's going to scale it proportionally from the center. There we go. I think that looks a little bit better. Then what next? Well, the cheese goes on the patty so it gets all melted, right? So I'm going to draw some cheese, again with a rectangle, and my smart guides are going to help me make that right up against the edge. It doesn't need to be too thick, something like that. And actually, it probably should be wider. So I'm going to zoom in here, move it out to the edge, and that way, it'll just stay the same width as the patty. And I should probably round off these corners as well. So I'll grab it with the selection tool, zoom in nice and close, and round that off. And then it needs to be a nice yellowy color. And I might be able to base this off of the mustard of the other layers. So let me just grab my eyedropper, hold down Shift, and click. And there we go, we've got the yellow color. That's probably a little too mustardy. I want to make it a little more orange. So I'm going to just adjust the hue a little bit so it's a little more cheese colored. There we go, I think that's great. And then I'm going to put a nice layer of tomato on this. So I'm going to just grab another rectangle, click and drag a rectangle there, line it up in the center, and then change the color to this nice bright red probably. Not the hot dog red because tomato is a little bit more saturated, I think. Maybe around there. Click OK. And that's a little hard to see on the background, but let's see what it looks like when we put the top bun on. Before I put that top bun on, though, I want to round off the corners a little bit. Not 100% like this, but just rounding off the corners a little bit. And then I want to put a nice piece of lettuce on top, so another rectangle. Here we go. This one will be super thin, and it needs to be green. So let's choose a nice leafy green color. Something in that range. Might be a little bit too bright. It's kind of giving me some vibrating eye strain there, so I'm going to turn that down a little bit. I think that's better. And typically the lettuce sticks out a little bit, so I'm going to zoom in nice and close, hold down Option while dragging, and maybe that's a little bit too much. I'm just going to actually go to my Properties panel and turn the width down by tapping the down arrow key. Hold Shift to do it by 10 pixels, something like that. And I want to round off the corners as well, so I'm going to select it, zoom in nice and close so I can see those corners and round it off. Okay, now I just need the top bun, which I can actually just duplicate this object to do that. And a really quick way to duplicate an object that already exists is have it selected with the selection tool, hold down Option or Alt on a PC, and we get this double arrow. And then if I click and drag, I can even hold Shift to make sure I'm only going straight up. Let go of the mouse, and that's going to duplicate the object. Now I want to spin it all the way around, so I'm going to grab the bottom right, or any of the corners really, to where we see this double arrow that's curved. Click, and that allows you to rotate it. And if you hold Shift, you can snap to 45-degree increments. There we go, I've flipped my bun around. I want to make the top piece of bread a little bit thicker, and then I'm going to make the corners much more rounded, actually all the way rounded. So I'm going to select with the direct selection tool this top corner, hold Shift and click on this top corner, and then round them out to 100%. All right, now I'm going to zoom everything out and take a look at this burger. This one looks a little bit thin to me. It's kind of sad looking, but I think what actually is the issue is that it's too wide. I don't really need to make it any taller. I just want to make it a little bit skinnier. So I'm going to make the selection of everything, hold down Option or Alt to scale from the center, click and drag on this right anchor, and just bring it all in just a little bit, something like that. That looks a little bit more proportional to what I'm used to seeing. Now I just want to make sure that all my corners are rounded the way that I intended them to be. So I'm just selecting with the direct selection tool and clicking on the objects. And I think I'll make this bottom one just a little bit shorter. There we go. And I think this lettuce is a little too thin, so I'm going to move the bun up a little bit and then increase the thickness of that as well. Drag that back down, round off the lettuce 100%, and I think that's looking fairly decent. But I'm not really happy with the way that this cheese looks. It's kind of just this flat pill shape. It doesn't really look like that appetizing. So I want to make it look like it's kind of melted and dripping down onto the burger patty. So I'm going to do this using some more rectangles. If I grab this rectangle tool, I'll hold down, or I'll press the eyedropper tool actually to switch to that and sample the color with nothing selected. And that's just going to load it up in my fill. Then I'll switch to my rectangle tool and start drawing some rectangles aligned to the top edge of the cheese. So maybe something like this. And then I'll switch to my direct selection tool, A on the keyboard, and round everything off. And that kind of overlaps on top of the slice of cheese and kind of looks like it's dripping down. I'm going to do this a handful of times at different widths and different lengths, just rounding everything off so that it looks like it's nice and melty. So I'll just keep doing this along the cheese. I don't have to go the entire way. Maybe I'll just add some accents over here on this edge. Maybe this one could be shorter, this one could be taller. Making sure to round this off to 100% on each one of these rectangles. And then maybe I'll do the same thing over near the right edge, something in this area. I'll grab another rectangle, draw it down, make this nice drip of cheese. Then I'll duplicate this one, hold down Option, and move it over. The Smart Guides is helping me move it just on the horizontal axis. And then make it thinner, maybe not quite so tall. That looks good. Make sure those corners are nice and round. Which, by the way, if you're trying to scale down an object that has rounded corners and it's giving you problems, it's probably because you don't have a checkbox selected. So if I make this bigger, and then I try and make it thinner, you see how the corners are scaling down with it. So it's automatically keeping that roundness based on how small I make it. But if I undo here and then click off of my artwork, my background layer is locked. So when I click on this, it's basically selecting the artboard. Then I'm going to get my document properties in the properties panel. And this little checkbox right here, scale corners, is what's allowing me to scale this down any further. If I were to have that unchecked, then if I try and make this any smaller, it can't because the corners aren't able to be compressed any further unless they are scaled, which I just disabled. So if you're running into that issue, make sure that you have scale corners turned on, and then it will preserve that rounding and I can make this whatever shape I need it to be. And then I'll do the same thing on this edge. So I'll just make a rectangle right on the end, round it all off. I'll make another rectangle right here, round it off. And maybe this one on the end is a little too extreme. I'll bring it up, round those to 100%, and then make sure that these two are touching. And there we go. I've got some melted cheese on top of that patty. It looks a little bit more realistic now. And then I think this red color is a little too bright, so I'm going to make it slightly darker, a little more saturated. Click OK. And I think that's a better tomato color. Now I want to add this shadow. To do that, I'm actually just going to copy and paste this one over here. So I'll unlock the hot dog, select it, copy, and then paste. And actually, that didn't paste it where I wanted it to. It pasted it directly on that same layer. I need it to be on the cheeseburger layer, so I'm going to undo, click on the cheeseburger layer, and then paste so that it pastes where I needed it. So I'll lock that hot dog layer back up, grab that shadow, and drag it below all of these cheeseburger items, and move it to the center of the document. Scale it in here and then move it up a bit, making sure those corners are nice and rounded. I think that looks pretty good. Maybe tap it up just a little bit. And there we go. We've got that shadow. I think it's a little too wide. I'll bring it in. And this is actually an instance where I don't really want Smart Guides on. So I'll press Command U so that I can transform this a little more freely. There we go. Just make sure those corners are nice and rounded out. And I think that shadow looks pretty good. Maybe it's a little too high. Drop it down, comparing it to the hot dog over here. But I think that looks pretty great. Now, if you remember, I made the text layers and the frame slightly blue. Since my background is now red, instead I want to change this to be slightly red instead of slightly blue. So I'm going to click on this fill color, go to my color mixer, turn that red all the way back up, and instead take down some of the blue and maybe a little bit of the green as well. So now I've just got something that's slightly off of that white color again, but if I double click on the color picker, you can see it's in the red zone. Maybe I don't want it to have such a magenta influence, so I'm going to turn it up to red, and then I could even do it this way where I just pull in a little more red color here. I don't want to creep into the pink territory, but something like that. Still looks convincingly white, but it blends into the background a little bit better. And then I just want to make sure I do the same thing for that background frame. I'll select it, press I for the eyedropper, hold down Shift. Oh, make sure that my stroke is active actually. Hold down Shift and then click on the text. And now that frame is slightly red, this one is slightly blue, and the colors just work much better together for each design. But they both have very, very similar compositions, the exact same art direction, so they feel very much like they go together. Definitely want to make sure that I save. All of that's ready to go, and then it'd be really smart to just do a little bit of organization over here and label things. Now, all of these rectangles up at the top are those little cheese drips. But all of them could really exist in a single group. I don't need all of these individual pieces of cheese dripping down. And the rectangle for the cheese looks like it's right here as well. So I'm going to grab that and move it up with the rest of the cheese, and then hold Shift and click on the target for all the other pieces. And that's going to make a selection of everything. And I'll press Command G to group everything and rename this cheese. And then I just want to label all of the individual parts. So lettuce. Oops. Got the tomato. We've got the patty. The top bun. The bottom bun. The text that says cheeseburger, and then the rest of our items. Okay, so now I'm just going to rearrange this so that it's the same order as it is visually in my document. Just keeping that same organization really helps you visually identify things in your layers palette better. So bottom bun, patty, cheese, tomato, lettuce, top bun. Great. Now that everything's nice and labeled, I'll make sure that that is saved, and these two art pieces are 100% done, and they're ready to be exported. And I'm going to show you how to export your artwork in a different video because I realized I just covered a whole lot of information and I dumped it all on you at once. You're probably overwhelmed. You're probably a little fatigued, to be honest, so you should take a break now, go get a drink of water. But the reason why I'm giving you all of this all at once during the orientation week is because you need to understand how all of this works. You really need to dive in with both feet forward so that you can get an understanding of how to make things in these programs. A lot of these same concepts are going to transfer over to Photoshop. So it's important that you really just get a good overview and see a very simple workflow of how to make something like these two pieces of artwork. So, like I said, take a break, take a breath, maybe go walk around the block, and then come back and move on to the next video.